Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're talking about Horrible Histories, Rotten Romans, a 2019 British comedy film based on a series, based on a book, all by the same name. And I think we have a lot of thoughts about this one. But first, I need to introduce, we have another special guest joining us, a senior at the University of Lynchburg. Welcome, Emma Coffey. We're glad to have you on the show.
Yay.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, Emma, we'll start with you. We can, as we get into it, we can give a little context because probably most of our listeners have not heard of this film or have seen it because it's actually pretty tricky to track down if you're not a resident of the UK. But we'll start first with you, Emma, if you want to just elaborate on, did you dig this movie and sort of what's your relationship to Horrible Histories?
I did dig this movie. I thought it was a really, really good time and I enjoyed it a lot. And I guess my relationship to this movie is that I'm doing a project for Dr. V's Roman Civ class, and I decided to look at Boudica. And I thought this would be a good movie to pick just to look at modern reception of her as a character and just see what other people have done with her.
So just a little context before I jump back to Emma. So like the plot of this movie is basically it's like and help me out if I'm missing anything, but it's set during the reign of Nero, and Claudius dies, and Nero is leading a sort of oppressive regime in Britain, and that sparks Boudica's rebellion. And then so we've got a sort of the main characters are a young Roman soldier and a British rebel. And this is sort of set against the background of Boudica's revolt in the, 60s?
I should have looked it up, but I did not. I'm just realizing, because when you talk about it like that, it sounds more serious than it is.
No.
If somebody just heard that description of this movie, I would think of it like a gritty historical, right? And this is the opposite.
There's murder plots. There's a rebellion.
This is a musical.
Yes, I should have mentioned that this is a musical.
Which I did not know going into it. So when the first song started, I was like, what is happening?
Full confession, by the later part, I ended up skipping through most of the songs.
I'm sorry, but the Boudica song is a banger. I keep going back
to it. I was going to say, I think Nero's song was my favorite. Actually.
Nero's was really good. Fun.
I think Nero might have been my favorite part, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
So Emma's doing this essay project for Roman Civ and Horrible Histories I use in class occasionally, usually Groovy Greeks, because I think we talked about it in the podcast before, like the depictions of the battle between Hector and Achilles is never shown as Hector runs away. Horrible Histories, because they're spoofing and making fun of, but they're staying really close to the source material. That is the only time I've seen a depiction of Hector versus Achilles and Hector runs around the wall to get away. And I think that's what's really interesting about Horrible Histories and maybe problematic for the movie is that it's meant to be educational in a certain degree while being funny and entertaining. But then at times, because you're supposed to be laughing at it, you're not supposed to be taking it seriously. You start to question, unless you really know the source material, you're not quite sure what is supposed to be true or not. A lot of the times, how much of it is just for fun and how much of it is making fun of things that seem so ridiculous but exist in the source material.
Yeah. And I think that works so well in their short little YouTube clips in a very small, we're focusing on this one little weird, ridiculous fact that we can tell you is true, and we're presenting it in a very silly way. And I mean, yeah, I've used it in class as well. It's fun, and it kind of makes things feel a little less sad and boring and depressing in a history class. But sitting through an hour and 30 minutes of it was kind of weird. All that to say, I don't think I dug this movie, guys. But also, I think maybe I'm not, am I the target audience?
No.
I don't know.
This is one of my questions. But first I want to get back to Emma. So you're doing a project on Boudica. Sorry. I was thinking about it because at the end of the movie, a rat comes up, a puppet rat comes up and tells you, but he says I'm going to tell you which parts were true. And he mentions one thing about we don't know how Boudica died. And that's all he says. And then it's just 10 more minutes of rat gags over the ending credits. sorry. I'm in a state of just apoplexia. This movie, I did not dig this movie. I was frustrated by this movie. So, Boudica, yeah. Because I guess we don't have a lot of on-screen depictions of Boudica, at least as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot. Like, she had her key songs, and there were a couple times when she had, like, her rally moments. And there was also the scene where, I think it's towards the beginning of the movie when she got the news, like, her husband's will was being read, but then she didn't get anything, even though it was supposed to be divided between her and Nero. And she was really pissed about that, rightfully so.
And you've been doing some research into the primary sources, and part of that was the end credit scene was like, there's two claims about how she died. Both of them, she wasn't ever actually captured by the Romans, but one is drank poison, the other got sick and died. So when you were looking at primary sources, like what was told about her, and who was talking about her?
So the two primary sources that I read for this one was from Tacitus and the other was from Cassius Dio, and they were both pretty mean to her, at least like in terms of tone, because it's like, how dare a woman of all people rebel against the Romans, and the fact that there was a rebellion in the first place. It was just really wild to read it, just because the tone was really harsh. They used like really condescending terms. I think they called them savages and heathens like so many times.
Or as this movie would say, sausages.
Yeah. Yes. Maybe sausages would have been better. At least it would have been funnier. But I don't know. It was just really wild to me, because it's like these guys, like both these Roman authors, like write about her like almost like 100 years after it's all happened, like 100 or 200 years after these events have happened. So it's like, it's really hard to tell like, what really did happen, and how did they know about her in the first place if there were no previous sources written during the time the rebellion happened.
Great questions to ask, for sure.
I mean, when you get into a lot of, this applies to even the emperors and stuff themselves. Like everything most of what we have about Nero is way after the fact, and from a sort of class of people that was notoriously at odds with him as emperor. So yeah, let's start. Actually, we can talk to this because that's kind of the gist of the project and talk about Boudica. And so the metaphor or the analogy that this movie kind of goes with is like Boudica as rock star. Mm-hmm. But, you know, she's like a Mick Jagger or like a Joan Jett or I don't know exactly if there's a particular one in mind, but like her rebellion is basically framed as like a rock tour where she's going around and just picking up more and more steam, which is, I don't know, it's interesting. I guess it's a fun conceit. But again, I think like to Eli's point, like the joke or the conceit or the premise is something that I think works well for a 5-minute YouTube video. But then this movie was an hour and 55 minutes long. Very much longer than I thought it was going to be. And the joke sort of sustained over that long. And then by the time you get to the end, I don't know, I just found the whole thing very strange by the end of like, because it ends with like her tour getting massacred by the Romans, basically.
Yeah. So it's like, how are we mixing this like very real, violent historical event that is a battle, and like the characters are on two sides of it, and they like decide that they don't want to kill each other like on the battlefield. Yeah, and then like nobody really dies. There's like maybe some blood, but
okay, can we talk about the healing scene just for a second?
Yeah,
sure.
So towards the end of the movie, Nick Frost, who's the
dad
and the chief of their tribe.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is accidentally like whacked with an axe or something like that. He's lying there dying. And then our Roman hero, Addy, basically is like, I know how to heal people. And so I'm just going to put some honey like over the shirt, basically. That was the part that I couldn't, like, I get maybe, and this comes, I think, again, to the tone, but it's like the way they heal him is they literally just put honey on top of his shirt. They don't even like, I mean, I guess he can't show like a gory wound, but like, I was just like, what is going on?
Well, and vinegar too. So like, it literally is just trying to throw in a bunch of fun facts into a storyline.
So this is, I think, the core. I'm going to go off on a whole thing. I'm sorry, Emma, for hijacking your project.
Fine.
But I think there's like two things are at odds here, where like this movie is simultaneously peppered with like historical tidbits and fun facts, like that Romans would eat dormice or used vinegar and honey for antiseptics, or the way the bathrooms are set up. So it's like the trees in the forest are like all these like discreetly sort of like true, interesting historical tidbits. But then the forest is more indebted to British television and pop culture receptions of the ancient world. Like just the way, like the sets, the costuming. I mean, if I don't want to get really nitpicky, stuff like the statues were all white and the columns were all white. And just the other things where this comes back to like, who is this for? Because the one thing that immediately turned me off is they dragged poor Derek Jacobi back to reprise his most iconic role ever as Claudius. And he comes back for this. And I sent Eli and Christy like the GIF from The Godfather where it's like, look how they massacred my boy. But also like what, like if this is targeted at a younger audience, like who is this for? Because like they are not going to appreciate a Derek Jacobi I Claudius joke. They have no idea what's going on there. And it feels like a version of, it's like a Monty Python / Blackadder pitched at a younger audience, but then a lot of those jokes are not going to be appreciated by a young audience. But yet an adult audience like me, I was like, what is this garbage?
It kind of makes me wonder if reception was not good of the film in general, which is surprising. And you could tell like there's a scene where like what I like about it is the intertextuality of the film, because you've got reference to the life of Brian and like when grandma is learning how to write in Latin. Got Farticus being the Spartacus jokes.
Who's going to get who is the Farticus joke for?
It's like, I kind of want a British person on here. It's like, how much of this is just such pop Roman knowledge because you Brits are obsessed with the Romans that like, you know, it doesn't matter what age you are, you will get it versus, and maybe that's why they haven't bothered to try and transfer its availability to American audiences, because it was a struggle to watch this movie if you're not part of the UK. So like, I don't know. I don't know who the audience is. It's like, I just know of it because I like horrible history clips. The Boudica song was actually 11 years old. There's like one just original song and they rewrote it for the film so it doesn't give away her death at the end, which is interesting. So Emma, you said like, I never quite came out. It's like, I kind of dig this too. I don't know if I'd rewatch it, but I like it for the fun facts that you can try and dig out of it. Like I don't know. Intellectually, I don't like the storyline, but I like all of the references and thinking back to where are they getting this information from. So maybe it's just for nerds, classical nerds, maybe. So Emma, what do you think if you would, when I show these clips in class or like students your age, would they enjoy this, do you think?
I think maybe it also just depends on your type of humor in general. I mostly enjoyed it because it really did feel like a wannabe Monty Python, but it just fell so flat. That's part of the reason why I dug it, just because I know the Farticus joke is for Spartacus, but I also all I could think of was Biggest Dickus as well.
Yes!
Like that's what came to my mind. But yeah, it really did feel like for part of it, it was like a wannabe like Monty Python, like montage, like making the noises when they were in like the war room for Nero. All I could think of was coconuts from the Holy Grail.
Is because it is very much, I mean, there is like a strong tradition in like British comedy for these kind of historical based, like Monty Python, obviously, but Blackadder was, you know, a series that ran forever. It's my sort of big gripe is like the tone that this show is pitched at, whereas like Blackadder and Monty Python, like, even though they are making jokes that are, I guess, like, just as dumb, like Biggest Dickus, but I find Biggest Dickus funny in a way that I didn't find, I don't know. There was a lot of, like, toilet humor in this film. Like, poop jokes, bathroom jokes, vomit.
People just kept throwing up, and it was really upsetting to me.
Yeah, if you're one of those people that, like, if, like, the sight or sound of somebody else being sick upsets you, maybe don't watch this movie. The first scene, they get Derek Jacobi to throw up poisoned mushrooms.
Yeah, it's like, no.
Which is urine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he covered, and the inciting incident is that the main character, swaps out gladiator sweat for horse urine, and Nero rubs it on his face.
Technically has some gladiator sweat in it.
Yeah,
just
it's like
a little.
It's one part gladiator sweat. I mean, to be fair, rubbing gladiator sweat on your face also is a little gross.
It's disgusting. But
yeah. Lej, what do you think about, like, who is the audience for this? Like, who would actually appreciate this movie? Because I actually enjoyed it for the fact that, like, I think for that same question, like if you're not really familiar with source material or the Roman world, you might feel lost on like what's supposed to be funny versus true. But for me, it's like, it's really enjoyable to sit there and like piece out. I'm like, yeah, that's in the historical records. Whether or not it's true, I think that's the part I don't like either, is like framing this all as true. It's like, well, actually, it's what these two, as Emma pointed out, two later historians wrote about. And a lot of those pieces were smear pieces, especially like if we think about Nero. So
right. Well, I'm thinking about when Orla captures Addie and like she's giving him food and he's like, don't you have any flamingo wings or
isn't it tongue?
like,
Flamingo
tongue or something, or he says like a whole list of like the really weird funky foods that come out of like one Roman cookbook. And we know that like your ordinary everyday Roman soldier or even middle class person probably didn't eat flamingo tongues all the time and like would have been pretty familiar with parsnip soup. Like,
but there was a garum joke. Right,
there was a garum joke. Did you bring some like fermented fish juice to put on top of it? Yeah. But it's like those two things are both true, but also need nuance, right? Like fermented fish and like salty products are really extremely popular and probably would have been available to wide ranges of the population in various forms. Like fancy, crazy, like even dormice was like you would fatten them up with hazelnuts in a little pot. And like, we're not an everyday kind of a thing.
Yeah, we're getting, that's like the foie gras of
yeah, exactly. And so I feel like, you know, both of these things can be true. And the way that they're presented in that sort of ridiculous, spoofy kind of fashion sort of makes it all lie flat and feel the same when there are various levels of, I guess, truth and nuance and context that I think make history a lot more fun sometimes.
So sort of on this note, I want to kick out. So like we talked a little bit about like the way this show is kind of indebted to a very particularly British pop culture understanding of ancient Rome, right? That comes like that basically goes like to I Claudius to Monty Python to Blackadder. Although Blackadder doesn't do ancient Rome, but it's sort of a piece. But then the other thing is like the thing that I kind of was most scratching my head and like getting at my critical brain was about like Britain's relationship, one, to its own history, and two, to its own history of imperialism and colonialism, which this movie is feeding into in a way that this is probably the part that sat weirdest with me. But I have my thoughts, but I want to kick it out first to see what you all think.
That was what I, especially when there was the line between Orla and Addie of like, empire, where it's like British doesn't have an empire, and I'm in my head I'm just like yet, and that's very and like the final song too, which is basically a song about Romanization to an extent.
Yeah, it's a lot of the what have the Romans done for us kind of thing.
Yeah,
that joke.
And going back to like what they call these two groups, like it's alliteration, but it's the crazy Celts is like their clips they do for the TV show versus the rotten Romans. And it's like, well, that's your British legacy is one group you're calling crazy, barbaric, and savage, and the other is genocidal, rotten, horrible people. And that's your legacy of which we're making light of in this movie.
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, Emma, like in terms of like a pro-Britain, Boudica's very like anti-Rome, and like how do you see that sort of fitting into like a Roman history and putting her in this rock star light? I realize that's a really big question. I just asked you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine. I'm trying to think of how I can word this because I had thoughts earlier.
Well, maybe is it when you watch this film, does it seem, you know, of all the silliness going on, does it seem pretty pro Boudica? Like, does it seem to you show her in a positive light, and why so?
I honestly don't know, because it's just like, I have mixed feelings of just like how they represented her, because it felt like they were making fun of her, even though it was like a really serious issue. Like I said earlier, she had every reason to be really, really mad at the Romans for screwing her over and not holding up their end of the bargain and just taking it all for themselves, which I do think kind of goes in with the whole yet thing for the British Empire, because they did the same thing. But I don't think they took her seriously, even though she did like a pretty phenomenal thing. I mean, yes, she did lose, but she still did like hold her own for a time against the Romans, and being able to unite all of those tribes. Like, yes, there were issues apparently getting them together, but the fact that she still did it is still pretty remarkable to me. I don't know if I'm answering the question. I hope I am.
Yeah. No, I think you totally are.
I think like the interesting thing, and what is it, again, it's like very particularly British, is like in a story like this, because it's like, I feel like they can afford to have like crazy versus rotten, like the way Chris was saying, because the British in this context are both, at least modern Brits, are both colonized and colonizers, right? Like, because they eventually are, they are the product of this, you know, layering of Celtic and then Roman and then later Saxon and Norman and all these other cultures. And so like they can sort of afford to make a joke like, oh, you illiterate savage Celts, where your most advanced form of medicine is a dog licking someone, and then whereas the Romans are just these like cruel, imperialistic, haughty, haughty, and like that very much in like the way the Romans act are very much sort of is reminiscent of like British imperialism. And like this is the one context in which I feel like you could have this ad, because if you made this about the British Empire and any other group of people in the world, it would be deemed as quite insensitive and inappropriate and problematic if the way the Celts were depicted was any other group. But it's because it's like both sides in this conflict are British, at least, you know, in the modern lives. Right. We can have this, but then I think it also, in a sense, that becomes like a pernicious mask for like attitudes about empire and conquest and occupation and things like that.
Yeah, because they are really having their cake and eating it too. In this situation. And like I think the end musical number about sharing,
yes,
and how like sharing is caring or whatever, it's like that, I think, masking like the actual really like atrocities of things that happened, and also the actual like significant things that Boudica did. Like she destroyed multiple towns, and like she really like gave the Romans a run for their money, and they like allude to those things. They're, you know, like, oh, you've been to all these places and now you're gonna wreck London, and it's like, but wreck in a rock style. Like,
most of the jokes all fell flat except for one that legit got an earned chuckle from me, which is when, God, what's his name, the general is looking at London and goes, oh no, London burns, it's a terrible fire, let's hope that never happens again. I was like, ha ha ha.
It's really interesting because it makes me look back at things like, you know, Life of Brian, Monty Python, where, you know, at that point, British has been an empire, and it's trying to it like wants to highlight the good things of empire, but not frame them as the ones being the conqueror. So it does it through its discussions of Rome as conqueror. Like, oh, what have the Romans given us? Well, it's given us all of these things. And it's so weird to think about, like, how many cultural groups do we get to look at with this long history of having been colonized and then turning the tables and colonizing so much of the world? Like, we don't get a lot of nations and histories like that. And it's kind of like someone is bullied and therefore they become a bully, that like bulk up and become a bully themselves so they don't get bullied anymore. But now, yeah, it wasn't great that you were bullied and your reason for, you know, trying to protect yourself, but then you turned that on other people. And it's like, how often do we see that historically in terms of like, I'm sure it's happened, but we have such a written record about it. That's interesting to think about. And as a result, we get this weird genre of film.
Yeah, but they do really gloss over, like, I think it's paralleled in the main plot, right? Which is like the Orla Addy sort of love story, which is also, it's Pocahontas / Avatar /
Hey, they don't kiss. It's a friendship.
It's a friendship.
Fair enough. All right. Yes, it is a very chaste
I'm okay with
relationship.
That.
Yeah, that's fine. It didn't
we're good with that.
Anything else.
Yeah.
But like, so like in the movie, Addy is the one who comes up with the plan that allows the Romans to defeat Boudica's rebellion. And the Brits are very quick to forgive that, right? Where she's like, it's no big deal. And like, and this is like maybe the larger thing where it's like, for this movie that's like, essentially it's a YouTube skit that's been drawn out into a feature-length film. And then when you have to have like plot and characters and arcs and things like that, it all hits very flat, because it's like, you know, we just want a song about like Nero killing his mom,
which was great.
which was so great.
We'll come back to Nero in a second.
Please.
But like the way that it was all like, oh, there was like, yeah, like everyone's just saying like, oh yeah, like the 2 cities were burned, lots of people were killed, the Romans massacred this whole rebellion that was approaching 100,000 people, and then at the end it's like, oh, it's all cool because now we're sharing cultures. Which also feels very it feels very one directional, the way the sharing is happening.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, yeah. Also, highlight of the moment, X-Men was like...
Another goddamn, sorry, Emma, but this is like the 6th movie now we've covered that's like about where the Legion of the Ninth shows up.
Oh my goodness.
And so, like, if I have to see another goddamn Legion of the Nine in one of these movies, I'm gonna lose it.
But like, if they were actually X-Men, wouldn't that just be the 10th? I was like, what?
X-Men. I don't know.
X-Men.
Okay, it just looked like they were just doing X-Men.
It
bothered me because I feel like they needed to establish the IX and not just the X.
Yeah. At least they kept that short and sweet of just a X-Men joke, and they slaughtered them, and they're like, and that's all we need to talk about for the X-Men.
And now we're done.
Okay, I am curious because all of the stuff with the Celts was definitely weird and forced, it felt like a lot of the time. I liked some of Boudica's stuff, but when it came to like Claudius and Nero, I didn't realize it's Kim Cattrall playing Nero's mother.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm like, they've got some good cast. Also, randomly, one of the legionnaires that's friends with Addie, he's also on Sex Education on Netflix.
Yep.
Oh, oh God, what's his name?
I forget his name too, but I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, he looks, so it's like they have a fairly recognizable cast in a lot of these roles.
And Derek Jacobi
to reprise his role,
one of the like elder statesmen of like British theater, to reprise like his most iconic role of all time,
and then he puked.
I mean, I don't know. I guess I can't judge. I mean, a paycheck's a paycheck, I guess, but like,
or because Kim Cattrall is not someone I would have thought would be into like the British stuff, and so I was curious, like, how well is Horrible Histories known in the UK? Like, it is a really popular thing that people are like, yeah, I'm on board for a quick cameo in that, because why not?
I guess.
I don't have an answer. We should have got a British person on the show to answer, because I think a lot of these questions could be answered by someone who grew up in Britain.
That is fair. So I guess, yeah, going back to my question, if this had just been a film spoof of Nero and his mom, and like,
I would have loved it.
I think I would have really liked this.
And I think it's because, like, Nero is one of those super weird characters that we have a lot of conflicting information about. And again, like, a lot of information that comes from sources that are extremely dubious and probably heavily biased. But, like, Nero's one of the fun ones where you can say a bunch of ridiculous stuff. And, he supposedly held his own, basically, rock concerts, right? Like, he would go out and play music, and he dressed up as an actor and like tried to do a bunch of insane shit, and he tried to kill his mom multiple times. And it's so funny, and this part worked. I don't know what about it, but like him trying to kill his mother repeatedly in song was beautiful.
Yeah. And there's so many little hints of like what's to come with his story. So like him practicing the lyre, the reference to London burning, but also it's like, that's going to happen in Rome eventually.
Yeah. Or he's like, and I'll probably live to be super old because I'm so young.
Yeah. Well, and I shared the Delphic Oracle story with my students in class about the one thing I love about Nero is like he has a run-in with the Pythia, and this is how it goes. I remember being told that story at Delphi, right outside the gates, being like, you don't mess with the Delphic Oracle.
Yeah. So I enjoyed that part. I thought it was weird and funny.
How about you, Colin? You seem to be
no. Dubious. I hate this whole movie. I hate everything about it.
Where's your sense of childlike wonder, Colin?
I have none. No, I'm like a broody. I'm a critic. What can I say? Like, it just reminds me, is like, again, like, classic British performances of like Peter Ustinov as Nero, where he is like, he is the saving grace of Quo Vadis, where he's got like a really good performance as Nero. This all just feels very lackluster. And again, I just come back to like how much of this is just like stuff that is just baked into, if you grew up going to primary school in England, how much of this stuff about like Nero and London fires and Rome and the Romans is just like baked into your being, your fiber. Sure. in a way that that's what's sort of the missing component. And so, yeah, again, also mostly just like after the 5th toilet joke,
yeah,
I'm just like, I'm out. I'm checked out.
And I think that's what's interesting to think about is this is a reception that I think is very much solely based on text. Mm-hmm. As opposed to other things we've looked at that is incorporating material culture. So I showed clips from King Arthur to the Roman Civ class because my favorite moments are when they're back in the fort. And I think that's very inspired by Vindolanda. And it's very inspired by the material culture. So even though there might be problematic aspects of that plot, there's still something about that movie that really resonates versus this one. And I think this goes back to Elijah's point earlier of it's missing the nuance. I think because it's just so based on text without recognizing that text brings all sorts of bias with it.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense.
This whole thing felt like a fever dream, honestly. Okay, I know I originally said that I dug it, but now that we're talking more things out and it's initial thoughts that I had in my head just didn't spring forward until now, I'm I don't know. It's just a really weird spoofy parody and yeah.
But also I guess this is my question. How educational is this? And is this movie supposed to be educational? Is it, because I know the series and the books are at least rooted in we'll educate, but we'll also make it fun. And we'll shine light on that history is not neat and tidy. It is ugly and gross and weird in ways. Mm-hmm. That I'm all on board for. And I think it works in sort of the miniseries, but when you put that form onto the medium of a feature-length film, which comes with sort of expectations from the audience, like characters, plot, resolution, 3-act structure, whatever, that sort of, I think it's trying to serve two masters, I guess, is what we're saying. Be that sort of true to the source material of quick, crass, pithy, irreverent comedy, educational thing, but then also comedy film. So it fails. For me, it fails neither, where it's this is neither educational because even though it's got lots of Easter egg educational tidbits, the larger narrative is I think sort of is doing a disservice to teaching people about antiquity. But then also, it's just not a funny movie. But I've made my position on this already very clear, so I'll cede the floor.
I think we've talked before about how we want another genre of movie set in the past and how it would be so much fun to have just a workplace comedy, but it be in a Roman setting or in a Greek setting or something. Mm-hmm. Because we're so stuck in that gritty historical and it has to be serious or weirdly mythological, fantastical action movie. And I think this is the third, I guess, area or genre that we're stuck in is the
third state.
The extremely silly spoof. Because thinking of Year One. Do you guys remember that movie?
I do, unfortunately.
Didn't watch it, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I feel that was also gross and had a lot of toilet humor and just was silly and was not at all focused on being educational. But this is sort of in that same space of where it's not a true comedy. It's trying to do something else as well, be that educational or just be stupid and gross. And I think it's still not quite hitting what we want from just an actual comedic, fun movie set in the ancient world. And that's what I want. I'm still looking for it.
I think Fellini is funnier in its own weird, perverse way. But maybe that's just me.
I don't know. I guess I was entertained, but I was more disturbed. Mm-hmm. By Fellini.
Do you guys thinking about the clips of Horrible Histories in general, do we like showing those because it creates an interest in the history? Because it's sometimes a lot of things that people have not heard about. I get really bored sometimes of talking about all the military campaigns. I don't talk about the military campaigns a lot in my Roman Civ class, Emma can tell you. That we have ideas of history that the way it's taught is super boring. It's knowing dates, it's knowing weird facts and locations. And this is a way to show the gross, the funny, the weird, or maybe the culture shock almost of the past. And we want that to like bring people in versus, you know, I'm going to archaeology stuff. It's like Indiana Jones brings in a lot of people into archaeology. It is by no means reflective of archaeology, but it gets the job done of getting people interested. So is that what this is? And maybe why we like it in short doses, but not a feature film?
I could see that because it is sort of putting a human face to a textbook, which can be difficult to do, especially if you just have like a 50-minute class and 3 times a week or something like that. And if you want to like jumpstart sort of that humanization of the past, I think that's why I used Horrible Histories. It's like, look, it's real people dressed up as Romans saying bad words. Like, this is, you know, like, people have been human all along, you guys. And I think that sort of helps that vision of when we're reading Tacitus or something horrifically boring. Sorry, Tacitus is so boring, Colin.
Why just whatever?
Just any sort of text. I'm just like, Colin, don't.
Tacitus is great. I don't know what you're talking about.
See, yep. But it's like, it's fun to imagine like the actual person behind Tacitus, right? Like, I guess this grumpy old dude writing his hot takes is a grumpy old dude, right? And he, you know, had other opinions and he had a life outside of his writings, and imagining what that life was like, I think can be really fun and certainly can bring people in beyond just the hot takes of Tacitus.
One of the things I wrote in my notes was that Drunk History, I think, does a better job of this than this, where that's got, I think, like the irreverency, and, you know, it's a vehicle for these, you know, dry historical stories, but it's told in a entertaining manner. You know, it's a different format. And again, I think there's a reason we don't have a Drunk History the movie, and I think that would not work. Like, the format does not sustain for 2 hours. Because I can't tell if this, like, I sort of feel like this movie is just trying to be like Year One, or like, I don't know, just some other like goofball raunchy comedy. But what do I know?
Yeah, I was thinking of like if SNL tried to put a film together, like reenacting the 2016 elections with all of their well-known, right? It's like worked great in certain little bits, but if they tried to put a whole film together about it,
terrible.
I think the other thing that I wanted to pose to Emma is, I just did a really quick look in terms of film depictions of Boudica. One's from 1927, and the other one was called Warrior Queen, which was in 2013, a British biographical historical television film, of which neither of I've ever seen nor had heard of until I just Wikipedia'd it. And so this is, when you were doing this project, this was like, it had just come out. I knew about Horrible Histories, and I'm like, oh, there's an actual depiction of Boudica. Why is her story? We've also talked in class about Zenobia from Palmyra. Why are these stories of really badass women of history, of either, you know, Zenobia was a Roman citizen, and technically so was Boudica. Like, her husband had actually bequeathed some of his land to Nero, like half, and half was supposed to go to Boudica and her daughters. So these were originally women of the Roman Empire that ultimately challenged it, and we don't tell their stories except for this one spoof version we have. So starting with Emma, why do you think that is? And then,
I mean, I think it's very easy to try and exclude women just because, I mean, Rome is very much men, we're amazing, let's put us on top, and women further at the bottom. And I feel like it's always just kind of going to be like that, just big disparity between men and women in history, especially like in the ancient world. Like, yes, there were women who had privilege, especially like if they were nobles and whatnot. And Boudica and Zenobia, like, they were privileged just because it's like they were higher up in society and they were able to have that power to be able to rebel against the Romans. But it's just, I don't know, I feel like there's always just that gap between it. And it's just, and also these were women who opposed the Romans. And they were pretty successful for a time. So it's like, of course, their stories aren't going to be told as much, because that's pretty embarrassing for a man. Hurts the ego. And I don't think the Roman emperors wanted that. Like, who wants to remember that? At least for them. And it makes Rome look weak. And Rome can't have that.
And it's also interesting that both their stories they end ambiguously. Like, Zenobia, supposedly, she is captured, she is triumphed, but they don't martyr her. They they marry her off to a Roman and she lives happily ever after in the villa for the rest of her life. And we don't know exactly what happened to Boudica either. She wasn't actually captured by the Romans. And I think that was an interesting aspect of the film with Orla. It's like, oh, I can't be bested by a girl. And yet the joke with Orla is like, she does best quite a few of the Romans the Roman males who think they are better. And it's just, it's kind of sad that this is the film that acknowledges that these really cool characters in history exist, but their stories have otherwise just not been portrayed in film and we get Cleopatra over and over and over again.
I guess, yeah. I was going to say I really agree with Emma's take that I think from our source material, it's like we're just never going to have the amount of information on these women that we have on just like any other guy in the Roman Empire, just because of who they were and what they tried to do. And yeah, I mean, they were not in the end victorious, and the victors are going to be able to control that flow of information, which, I mean, they even talk about in this movie. I think Nero's like, historian, don't write that down. It's like, of course, yeah, it is maybe sad that is being acknowledged here and not sort of explored. And yeah, I guess Cleopatra, I don't know. It's like she's a more, I guess, digestible, like, female character because she's supposed to be sexy, right?
Yeah. She's more alluring in some way, or some shape or form.
Yeah, and it's like nobody ever talks about how sexy and seductive Boudica was. She was like a badass. And that is not of interest, I think, to male storytellers, perhaps. But I also think if there was like an epics show, I feel like I've mentioned this before, about Livia, which is called Domina, which was still like, I mean, she was a very like Cleopatra-esque character, and there was a lot of like sexual escapades, but was also like kind of a scheming politician in so many ways. And I appreciated the show. I thought it was kind of fun. It did some weird things, but I also think it did some smart things in terms of focusing on a female character in the midst of like the biggest names that we have from the Roman Empire, like Augustus and Caesar and all of these other people. But the show focuses on Livia.
And Zenobia is also described as like very beautiful, very intelligent, knows multiple languages. I think that's an interesting aspect too, is like Boudica is interesting because she's not described that way. She's much more of the savage, but like if Rome has to be bested, at least she has to meet certain beauty standards and education standards and Romanness to be acknowledged.
Part of it is also, I think, is there's always like there's like a trope element that it kind of comes in with a lot of these figures, where it's like Cleopatra and Zenobia, to my mind, fit into a particular trope of like Eastern women, Greek adjacent, we'll say, Cleopatra and Zenobia. And I think they are sort of informed against one another. Like this trope reinforces itself, right? But the idea of like this woman sort of in the Near East, educated, sophisticated, or royalty of some sort. And then Boudica, to my mind, is also fitting a slightly different trope, which is sort of more in the lines of like Vercingetorix, who was the Gaulish sort of rebel, or Viriathus, who led a rebellion in Lusitania, sort of a similar figure. Or even, what's his name? The German, the one at Teutoburg. Arminius, thank you, yes. These guys also are Roman adjacent, where they might have sort of participated in Roman state apparatuses. There was maybe some kind of liaison between their local tribe and the Roman state. And Boudica, to my mind, sort of fits that model a little bit. But then, so the other element about Boudica, although again, she does, I think, get often left out of a lot of history books, but she's also like a British national hero. Like she's a bit of a British icon. And like there are statues of her, there are plays and operas dedicated to her. So she sort of is elevated, I think, to that status because she becomes something of a national hero and fits into a larger kind of, again, trope that exists in sort of popular and early modern media of like the doomed tragic warrior rebel, similar to someone like William Wallace or even Geronimo or figures like that, right? Where like it is like it's a hero that gets elevated, but then they're also like they always fail in the end, whether it's against the Romans or the English or the United States or something like that. You know, in the way that like, you know, this is my brain going as like a sort of literary critic person, like history is a genre. and like the way we write history and then tellings of history. And so there are genre tropes and things that tend to conform, and they tend to fall into little channels and things like that. And like we're sort of outlining like the channels that Boudica falls into, which is like one, the sort of short list of prominent women from antiquity that we have, but then also the channels of she is a Celtic rebel. She is she's nobility, or she's someone who sort of exists at the fringes of like British and Roman society. She becomes a sort of national hero after the fact, or like Joan of Arc or something like that.
Yeah.
And when we look back on history, we always want to understand we understand them all in relationship to one another. That's just how like our brains and just like genre works.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a coherent thought, but that's sort of where I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'm kind of at the point, it's like, I would love to see these stories shown in film the way we've gotten these other historical accounts. Maybe I don't. Maybe we've critiqued quite a few, but like I'd love to see a story of Zenobia. I'd love to see, and the idea that we don't have enough source material. Well, Agora was based on Hypatia, and we literally have one paragraph about her life.
You're right.
So it's like, obviously we can do it if we are
do something.
like, I would love to see more stories like that. And I'm wondering if we're close to getting to share stories like that. But I was thinking of the live action Mulan, which was also based on, a Chinese folk hero that was a woman, and like apparently works great when it's Disney animation, but when it becomes live action, it somehow isn't as appealing. And I never quite understand why these stories aren't as appealing when we try to contextualize them more in a realistic setting. Why do we only get these spoof or animated versions, and then we can be entertained in that way?
Part of it is I'm thinking is also, I think Cleopatra is an interesting comparison, because there's kind of two Boudicas, and like there's sort of two Cleopatras. Like there is a lived historical person who the access to whom is limited, right? We have snippets and fragments and glimpses and silhouettes, but we'll never really sort of be able to pin down, if it's even possible to really pin down a historical person and completely understand them, particularly someone so far removed. And again, there are all these, all of the intermediaries that exist. But then there's the also like Boudica and Cleopatra also just exist as characters in the sort of culture landscape. And in that, they kind of take on a life of their own, and they become symbols of something, whether it's Near Eastern exoticism and Orientalism and everything going on there, the seductress queen, or if it's the painted rebel.
Or the overbearing mother that is Agrippina, played by Kim Cattrall.
Yes. Livia is another classic example where like Livia now like exists. She's a character. She's a trope. They exist. I mean, I think even just like you look to something like Game of Thrones, and there are in Game of Thrones, yet you have your Cleopatras, you have your Livias, you have your Boudicas.
True.
And I think we could go through a show like that, and I'm thinking, right, we've got Ygritte is kind of our Boudica. We've got, I mean, there's any number. The Livias, you've got Circe as our sort of Livia. We've got right, these characters have now, while they're rooted in sort of some sort of historicity, but they become, I mean, almost like Socrates or Jesus or Plato or something like that, right? They exist beyond, or the Buddha or whoever, right? They sort of have transcended historicity and become characters.
Yeah, it's like it's never stopped Hollywood. They help feed and create those cultural ideas, but it's just stopped a depiction of a lot of these women that, because they're almost blank slates. Like we just have, Hypatia is a great example. It's like we just have this little blurb of information. We can make an entire film about that. Why not?
Consequently, I think the story we get is just cued into what the audience is looking for.
Which is why our whole podcast exists, to unpack that, right?
Yeah. I wonder if the window has passed, but like there was a window for a Boudica, or maybe there still is a window for a Boudica as we would like to see her, or a Cleopatra as we would like to see her.
Well, that's Zenobia coming eventually with Gal Gadot, so we'll see how that goes.
It's going to be a whole thing.
Oh, it is.
Yes.
It's going.
But
it's already been a whole thing.
For all the things that we like that Horrible Histories is doing, it also introduces a whole new batch of problems. And like for me, from my main hang up is like the way that while Horrible Histories is trying to sort of bring a fresh take or a fresh eyes, it's still, at least in this movie, it's still deeply rooted in, I think, what I saw as very old-fashioned notions of Romanization and the Roman Empire in Britain. And the narrative, it's almost like it reminds like the American equivalent that is like, the first Thanksgiving,
right?
Recording this over Thanksgiving break, but like the first Thanksgiving where the Pilgrims and the Native Americans got together and had a feast, and like that's the narrative that at least gets spun out in early education. And I feel like the Brits have a similar thing with like the way what Rome was, in Britain.
Yeah,
I think that's a perfect analogy, actually. It's this kind of happy, nice, bloodless, violenceless musical number.
We'll sing a song about sharing, even though this is immediately in the wake of a huge battle in which much blood was spilt.
Yeah, we had a discussion in my Roman Civ class about like, what is Romanization? What does that look like culturally? And I had originally used Devil Wears Prada scene where she's explaining fashion and how like, these fashion elites chose the sweater which you're wearing, but that doesn't acknowledge that fashion itself is often inspired by, street, what people are coming up with on their own. And
it's a top-down model.
Exactly. And it's like, now I just want to play this song to pair with that discussion, being like, how is this being reinforced?
But yeah, I mean, you see it in Life of Brian, right? Where like the Romans gave us education, aqueducts, public health. And I think it's again, for Brits, it's a way to sort of tacitly justify their own colonialism because we're civilizing the world.
I think it's been a while since we've gotten a hate on a movie, and we're being so critical about depictions of the past in a way we haven't been in a long time. And I think at the end of the day, it's like, do I want a not totally authentic representation of the life of Boudica, the life of Zenobia? I would love to see that film. Even if it's bad, I want to see it because at least it's a different storyline. And then we can, at the end of the day, every time we tell these stories, it's more reflective of our culture than, what it was in the past. That's why we still engage with it. So I guess for me personally, it's like, I want more badass women in film so that even if they get it wrong, even if they're not 100% accurate to her life portrayal, well, that's true of every historical figure we ever put in film.
Braveheart.
Yeah.
That's my thought. More badass women of history in film or drunk history.
Yeah.
But they already do that pretty well in drunk history.
Emma, do you have any concluding or finalizing thoughts?
I'm honestly just with Dr. V. I want more badass women in history as well, just to learn more about that, because we don't get that. Like, Thursday was the first day I'd ever learned about Zenobia, and I feel so silly for not having known anything about the Palmyrian Empire or any of that before. And it just makes me sad. I wish that's something we need to do.
I think that is something to consider, is like these stories have had alternative tellings because Hollywood tells very specific kinds of stories. They hire specific kinds of directors. Like we've known this for a very long time. I think that's where we do need to look, is alternative forms of media to that, where these stories are being told, because they probably exist, but they're just not in movie theaters a lot of the time. But I still want a film. I want movies. I need more things to watch. I have no time to watch them, but I want to watch more things.
I feel like they're more accessible that way as well. Like if you decide films are more accessible to everyone. So I feel like that would also be great, because maybe you can expand on your audience. Like, not saying that like books can't do that now, obviously, because great thing called the internet. But I mean, it has better chances of being able to reach like all corners of the world, and like more people can like do podcasts about it. Like, I don't know. Could be big.
Or Netflix short series. Like, we have so many true crime ones. It's like, let's mix it up, people.
Yeah.
Has anyone seen Woman King yet?
No.
This is exactly, I think, what Chrissy's talking about.
Yes, I was very excited for that. And then on the other hand, it's like the feminist in me also sees the problem. Because I read up on the history when I saw that was coming out. I'm like, female warriors. Well, that was needed because all of the men had died, and so this king's like, you know what, we got some women on the side, we'll train them up as warriors too. So it's very much feeding into this violent cycle, but it's still kind of cool, and it's historically accurate to some degree. So yes, I want more stories like that for me to pick apart like I just did.
Yeah. And on like the movie making side, I don't know, I watched a few things about just the making of Woman King, and like they did all their own stunts and was like super intensive.
Yeah, they went to like boot camp for a while.
Yeah. Which I think is so cool. And I love when there are so many physical and like real effects in a movie. And I think it makes it so much more fun than just like a bunch of CGI robots.
Yeah. The other thing that just one random other side note is Ms. Marvel that was on Disney Plus, and she goes back in time to partition. And it's like, I didn't even know Like, I knew that Pakistan and India had been separated. I didn't know like what its historical title was and like what was happening to people. It's like that was just a short snippet, and it was so fascinating, so interesting that and it's like maybe that's part of it too. Is like I want to get out of Rome centric, like the city stories, and you know our pitch for Gladiator 2 is like let's get the daughters of so and so to be, you know. And I think that's just it, is like Rome is so encompassing of so many cultures and stories. It's like we're like so well set up to like, let's unpack that. Let's do these stories that are Rome adjacent, if you will. The Mediterranean region's very big. It's very big.
Yes, it's huge.
That's our final thesis. The Mediterranean is big.
It's very big.
If you learn one thing, Emma, learn that.
I think I already knew that one.
Then you're set.
Yeah, you're doing good.
All right. I guess that's all my thoughts for the day is, well, for this podcast at least, because we have another one later today. But yeah.
Any other final thoughts?
Good.
All right.
Thanks for joining us, Emma.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think that just about wraps up our discussion. Thank you again, Emma, for joining us. As usual, you can find our podcast on Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, all that stuff. Go to our website, movieswedig.com. Follow us on Twitter at @digmovies. And we'll be back. We're about to go record another session about the Warriors. Come out and play.
Can you dig it?
We can dig it. All right. Thank you again, Emma, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye.